Welcome! I'm Ashley of The Ugly Sheep, and today we're going to make a bag out of hand-woven fabric. So I was supposed to make new fabric for this project, and it is mostly on my loom, ready to be woven. However, we had some personal family setbacks, and so I did not have time to make the fabric for this project. But I did have this laying around from last year. And so I'm going to use this fabric in order to make the bags. But first, we need to iron this because it has been sitting around for a while. I am fairly certain that this fabric is 100% cotton, but I use a lot of materials that are secondhand, so I don't actually always know the fiber content of the yarn I'm working with. For the most part, this fabric is plain weave. There are some style lines that run up and down the fabric where I omitted one of the strands so that you have two strands next to each other that are not woven into the plain weave. As we work our way through this project, you'll notice that one part of the fabric is a purplish color and one is white. And I had just woven two different weft colors on the same warp to get that effect. To start with, I'm just using a clear template that I have that helps get the proportions and shape of the bag correct. The benefit of this is the math is already done, and it is a small template to make a very, very small bag. So I'm able to test this on the purple fabric, which I have the most of, while still allowing me to have enough fabric to make one, maybe two full-size bags later. One of the difficulties I have with hand-woven fabric is that it doesn't really take tailor's chalk very well. I could probably get a marker for this, but the chalk itself is not good, so I just need different tools to use when I am sewing with hand-woven versus when I am sewing with commercial yarn or commercial fabric. Once my pieces are cut out, I am just going to cut out the handles for the bag. I'm not really measuring these, especially with it just being a small trial bag, so that I can figure out how to put it together. So the first time I sewed these, I actually sewed them incorrectly. And instead of just sewing one of the pieces and seeing how it worked out, I sewed both of them for some reason. So you'll see that I go down both sides of them, the pieces, and I also include going around the little cutout spots. That part I am not supposed to just go down like it's the normal part of the side. Here I'm noticing that I clearly made a mistake because it's just not coming out the way that I know it should. To fix this, I cut the square cutouts a little bit bigger on one of the pieces, and then I cut out, I think this is an old curtain, in a rough shape that matches in order to sew a lining to see how it comes together. This time I sewed it correctly, so then I was able to put the outer and the inner fabric together along with the handles. Once I had everything together, I just sewed around the top so that it would all hold. This bag really is only having the lining and the outer part sewed together along the top, and the lining is just floating inside. Once I knew that the first mock-up was right, I then went and cut my fabric that I'm going to use for the regular bag, size bags. First thing I did was cut the purple and the white apart, and then I cut the ends off. I folded my fabric selvage to selvage to make sure that I had enough fabric to make 2 bags. And then I kind of just cut it approximately in half, and I measured it to make sure that it was pretty close in size so that the size of the lining would be consistent for the size of the bags that I'm going to make. I just made the cutouts for the shaping of the bag 1-inch squares, but I have it folded so that the square is really 1 by 2. This way I have a good size base, and it helps me keep everything consistent since I don't have a template that is big enough for this size bag. Once I cut the lining out, I then cut the fabric for the main part of the bag out. And I did it this way because I used the white as my lining just to keep it separate from the outside of the bag since they're reversible. But I did that because the white is the less amount of fabric I had even after making the mock-up in the purple fabric. Now for the sewing of this round, it went much smoother, especially since I knew exactly how the construction should go, having done the smaller mock-up bag. So I'm really glad I did that because I have a usable mock-up now for this bag, even though there's some things that I'll change in another iteration before I get to my final design. Eventually these bags will be made out of a fabric that I am working on that is mostly white with pops of pink and purple, and they are going to go together the same way. And I was seeing if I can use handwoven on both the exterior fabric and the lining fabric. This lining fabric is a little thick because it is handwoven, and it's the same size yarn that was used for the exterior. I will probably need to think about using thinner yarn to weave a lining, but it does work and it gives the bag a little bit more structure for a very basic shaped bag as this with no pockets. And this time I did the bottom corner correctly from the beginning. Because this is just a very basic bag, the lining is sewn exactly the same way as the exterior fabric is sewn. Once the lining was sewn, I pressed the upper edge of the bag so that I could place the closures that I'm doing. Mine are just magnets, and I was hoping that they would be strong enough to go through the thicker handwoven fabric, but they really just are not. So I'm going to have to come up with a different solution when I make bags for sale. And so I'm not sure if I want to use the same magnetic closures and make it not reversible, which would be fine for the fabric that I'm making since it's going to be the same fabric inside and out, or to use a different closure method, which probably would also have the same issue where it would not be reversible. Or I will have to find a stronger magnet to close the bag if I want to have a reversible bag. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Once the magnetic closure was inserted into the lining, I lined up the bottoms of the lining and the outer fabric and pinned those so that as I folded over the outer fabric to make the top edge, it did not shift away from the lining. Then I matched up the outer edges to match the height of the lining edge before I then inserted the handles to where they're going to be. I use clips to keep the inner and outer layer of fabric together, and then I used pins to make sure that the handles stayed in straight. because clips, I find, just make the handles kind of ever so slightly not straight up and down when you sew over them, because you can't just clip directly through it. Like I did for the mock-up, once everything was in place, I simply sewed around the top of the bag. I had to take this a little slower than I normally would because I did not want the handles to shift out of place or for the lining to get bunched up, because the lining's actually a little too big, partially because I made them the exact same size as the outer side of the bag so that it could be reversible. Overall, this was actually a really easy bag to put together, and I can make kind of a diagram of what the final cutout would look like if you want, but it's actually just very easy to make it proportionally how you want and add an inch along the bottom before you cut the little squares out. And if you cut on the fold, it makes it much easier to make sure your front and back are exactly the same, versus having the template that I had for the first bag where you were cutting everything straight, and so if your template shifted or your measurements were a little off, it would not match. Looking at the amount of footage I have for this project, I think it took between an hour and an hour and a half to put both the mock-up mini bag and the regular size bag mock-up together. And that includes iron time and cutting out. So it's a fairly quick project to make as well. I think this little one is just so cute. I didn't do a great job sewing it, partially because the first time I sewed it, I did it wrong, but that's why I made a little one. This is also the size that the pattern I had made, which is really too small to do pretty much anything with. Maybe put a small gift in a bag. But I'm glad I did it small and didn't waste a lot of fabric learning how to do it, so that I had enough to make 2 versions of this one. I haven't finished the second one, but this one turned out really well, and I really like it. One of the things that I will change, though, is to make the straps longer. I didn't quite make them long enough. This does have a snap in it, a magnetic one, but it's not really heavy duty enough for this thick of a fabric. So if I were to use these specific magnets again, I will probably need to do it on a thinner commercial cotton that is the lining of my bag. I do have another type to use, but that will make it not reversible. So I haven't figured out what side I want out and what side I want in, because the outside, while it's really hard to tell on camera, it's purple, and the inside is white. And right now, because the closures don't work, it is reversible, so you can have it on either side that you like. So I haven't figured that part out. So when I do, I will be making another one as a test so that the fabric that I was supposed to make these out of can be made into bags for sale. But keep an eye out for those, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.